lot of goodwill among the people of Afghanistan. All right, time for our In Focus segment in which we're discussing about India and intra-Afghan talks, prospects for peace. I repeat, India and intra-Afghan talks, prospects for peace. Right, joining me are two very special guests, Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan and Professor Harshvi Pant. Professor Pant is Director of Studies and Head of the Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation. Now, the ORF is a privately held think tank headquartered in New Delhi. And Professor Pant has several books to his credit, including most recently, Indian Foreign Policy, the Modi Era. And Dr. Raghavan is a former Indian envoy to Pakistan and Singapore. He's also headed the Pakistan desk in the Indian Foreign Ministry. Today is the DG of the Indian Council of World Affairs, or ICWA. Now, the ICWA is a think tank funded by the Indian government. It was established way back in 1943. If I might add, for the benefit of viewers, the ICWA was declared as an institution of national importance by an Act of Parliament in the year 2001. Now, he's written 3 books, including one titled The People Next Door, The Curious History of India's Relations with, you guessed it, Pakistan. And hold on, we're not done yet. Ambassador Raghavan was only one of two Indians who sat at the table with Taliban at Moscow in November 2018. India sent him and another diplomat, former diplomat, to Moscow to take part in those Afghan peace talks, and that was a first for India. All right, coming to my guests now, Ambassador Raghavan and Professor Pant, welcome to News Night. If I can start with you, Ambassador Raghavan, would you like to share with our viewers your first-hand experiences or impressions about the Taliban, their ideology, what they stand for, and prospects for peace, given Taliban's propensity or proclivity for fomenting attacks inside and outside Afghanistan?
Well, that is the central question before this negotiation which began today, as to how to reconcile an insurgent group with a long history of using violence to achieve its political objectives,
right,
with a country which has a democratic constitution. Of course, these talks in particular are important because the history of Afghanistan in the last 30 years has been of governments being displaced either by coups or by armed action. So in that sense, the fact that the government of Afghanistan is sitting on the table with the Taliban is significant. The External Affairs Minister, as you had mentioned, said that the key point for these talks is that they should be Afghan-controlled, Afghan-led, and Afghan-owned.
Right.
My own impressions about the Taliban, such as they are that on the surface at least, they insist that they should not be judged purely by their history, and in fact, they are committed to achieving a peaceful settlement. On the other hand, the fact that these talks take place without a reduction in the number of attacks or without a reduction in violence does suggest that this is going to be quite a complex process as we proceed into the future.
Absolutely. Professor Pant, Ambassador Raghavan mentioned about the Indian Foreign Ministry statement and Minister's statement at that opening ceremony. If I can flag a couple of issues in that statement issued by the MEA, it says, as Ambassador Raghavan said, we have this consistent position, it should be Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, and Afghan-controlled. But this statement also says, and I quote the MEA here, the interests of minorities, women, and vulnerable sections of society must be preserved, and the issue of violence across the country and its neighborhood has to be effectively addressed, unquote. Your thoughts on those key points flagged by India as well?
Well, as you point out, the Indian position on on the process being Afghan-owned and Afghan-led is something that has been very, very consistent
Right.
and remains to be the pivotal position, the central position for India over the last few years. But I think what is more important for India is the kind of issues that you pointed out in the statement, that the gains of the last few decades are not lost.
True.
That whatever Afghanistan has gained in the since 2001 with the overthrow of the Taliban, then the democratic process whereby minorities, whereby women and other vulnerable sections of the society have been able to get a voice in the democratic process, that should not go away, because that would be dismantling the whole idea of modern Afghanistan. And in that sense, India has played a very, very important role with its projects, with its ideas, with the capacity building that India has done in Afghanistan. And I think therefore Indian foreign minister was insistent and underscored again and again that this is something that India values very, very significantly. And therefore for India, it is not simply a question of the process, but it is also a question of what kind of an outcome that process is going to produce. And I think that outcome, as far as India is concerned, should be a process where not only the involvement of various stakeholders is part of this process, but also the outcome in terms of a more inclusive democratic order that Afghanistan has been able to build over the last few years should not get dismantled. And I think that was very rightly pointed out by the Indian Foreign Minister.
Ambassador Raghavan, now correct me if I'm wrong, but these talks are essentially aimed at forging a consensus domestically inside Afghanistan between the government in Kabul and the Taliban. And there are various issues to be discussed here. The Taliban insists on having Sharia and Islamic system in Afghanistan going forward as well. There are question marks about its decision on enforcing a ceasefire going forward. For instance, upholding women's rights, minority rights, adhering to the constitution of Afghanistan, renouncing violence, cutting ties with all terror groups, and also stopping those killings. Now, if I can flag a couple of points here. Now, according to news reports coming out of Doha this morning, now Abdullah, the head of the Afghan delegation, called in his speech for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, but his plea went unanswered by Taliban co-founder Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, who made no mention of a truce in his opening remarks. Instead, Baradar repeated the insurgents' message that Afghanistan must be run through according to Islamic law. So your thoughts on these, outstanding issues that still need to be resolved between the government of Afghanistan and Taliban going forward as well?
Well, there are numerous issues. The first and immediate one is, of course, the ceasefire. But clearly what is also what you have at the table over there are two different ideas of Afghanistan which are colliding with each other. And these ideas can be summarized as being that of an Islamic emirate versus that of an Islamic republic. And there's a whole range of issues involved in terms of what separates these two ideas of Afghanistan. There is also a third factor which is equally significant, which is that of the US withdrawal. And the fact that these talks take place really under the shadow of US policy, which is determined by the fact that the United States is clearly exhausted by its longest military engagement in its history. So all these factors are at play. I don't think it is anyone's case that this is going to be a straightforward or simple set of negotiations. But the fact that this meeting is taking place, delayed as it is, the fact that at least on the surface, certain common points are being made by all the delegates, but most of all, the fact that people in Afghanistan want peace. I think these are all reasons to be slightly optimistic, although the road ahead is going to be very, very difficult and complex.
Indeed. Professor Pant, I want to quote an Afghan resident of Kabul, and according to a newspaper report, now this is a very profound statement to be made by a resident of Kabul. Now this gentleman says, according to news reports, My beard was black when the war began. It is snow white now, and we are still at war. Now, there's a fatigue setting in Afghanistan and outside about this. Obama called it an avoidable war. Trump called it an endless war. Now, in your estimation, do you think the U.S. is in a hurry to clinch a deal between now and November 3rd, when the elections take place in the U.S.? And if that is true, is that a good negotiating tactic? Because as John Bolton says, you and I may have the watches, but Taliban has the time.
Yes, I think, in some ways, this is a recipe for disaster if you think that elections in US should be the most important focal point in determining the trajectory and the outcome of these talks. But clearly, we have seen since Obama administration's days that there has been this desire on the part of successive administrations, and not simply Trump administration, to get out of Afghanistan. As you point out, there is a fatigue not simply in the international community, but in particular in the US. About this war, and I think there is a political consensus across the political divide that this war needs to end. Obama came with a certain agenda. He could not complete it. Mr. Trump also had a particular agenda, and if he, for example, can get a deal before November elections, then certainly he would tom-tom it and he would make it a big deal in his election campaign. So certainly he would be pushing for a deal. But what we have also seen in the past is that it doesn't really work like that. On the ground, there are different issues. The stakeholders are, in some ways not working according to the American electoral calendar. So in the past, this had happened, and I'm sure it would be very difficult for the Trump administration to control the pace of these negotiations. As we know, in February, America made its announcement that it wants to draw down from Afghanistan. And since that announcement, there has been this speculation about these talks. So now these talks would only begin, we are mid-September. So it has taken us so many months just to get to the very starting point of these negotiations. So I think it's very unlikely that the negotiations will proceed according to the American electoral calendar, howsoever hard the Trump administration might desire it to be given the electoral politics. So I think we should be cognizant of that reality. But of course, Americans would like to push and get an outcome before the elections, and that is the reality that all of Afghanistan and all the stakeholders in Afghanistan should be cognizant of.
Absolutely. Ambassador Raghavan, you're a keen observer of Pakistani domestic politics. Now, there are many stakeholders in Afghan peace, many actors, some good, some not so good. How do you view Pakistan's role in all of this, in the Afghan peace talks? Is Pakistan a part of the problem or solution? And how do you read the Taliban-ISI nexus, so to speak?
Well, it is no secret that nexus is very strong, and certainly there are many people in Pakistan, who feel that the current position, the outcome that we see today in Doha, is a vindication of all that Pakistan has stood for in terms of supporting the Taliban, despite all the promises it made to the United States and to the rest of the international community. So it is possible that there will be a view in Pakistan which feels vindicated, and there is a sense of triumphalism that despite all the pressures on it, the groups that it supported in Afghanistan have come a long way and may possibly be a very important element in the next government. But there is also another view in Pakistan, which might yet be a minority view, but there is that view nonetheless, which sees the domestic consequences for Pakistan itself of a radicalized regime appearing in Afghanistan again, and Pakistan has suffered the consequences of such radicalization within its own territory. So the backlash of nurturing radical proxies is a risk which Pakistan has taken in the past, and we have to hope and see whether that policy has now changed to some extent, or whether they are going to repeat the same mistakes as they did some years ago. The fact that the Taliban exists on the ground in Afghanistan cannot be airbrushed away.
Indeed.
Nevertheless, to make sure that the gains of the last 20 years are also not
Right.
discarded should be a key element of the Pakistan
Sure.
strategy as well. Whether that is so or not, we have to wait and see.
Absolutely. I'm afraid I've completely run out of time. So on that note, I want to thank both my guests, Ambassador Raghavan and Professor Pant, for sharing your insights and perspectives on this developing story. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.